Hello to English 3 from the past. Today you are going to be learning about Transcendentalism, but first I want to show you where you can access it in Schoology. We'll just go down to week 10 where we're at. Here's your note from yesterday about working on your book journals. And today you can see the Transcendentalism PowerPoint here and a few additional notes here. So let's get started. We last talked about Romanticism, a school of thought in which the highest power is nature. We see people as good and nature as awe-inspiring and beautiful, and even sometimes terrible. We looked at paintings which had a romantic look at the individual, at innocence, at beauty, that stressed the importance of the imagination. And we looked at some poetry that did the same. However, Romanticism really, in many ways, is not uniquely American. It's actually European. It came from German. It spread to Britain. And we did get it in the United States. But what's interesting about Americans is that we like to take something and shift it a little bit in order to make it uniquely American for us. And that is definitely the case with Transcendentalism. Transcendentalism is the American form of Romanticism, the thing that really we created that didn't come from another country first. So, Transcendentalism is kind of confusing, so I want to make sure that I take it slowly and really explain it. So, you should know that if we're going to do things in order, the timeline would be Puritanism, also known as rationalism, the revolutionaries, Romanticism, and then Transcendentalism. Transcendentalism sprang up in America, and what it means is the people who were Transcendentalists believed that there is an ideal spiritual state which everyone can achieve that transcends the physical, to go beyond what is typical. Transcendentalism is American Romanticism. Because Americans were more involved in social causes, those things became a part of the Transcendental movement. Transcendentalism also had different meanings for each person involved in that movement. So, where did Transcendentalism really start? The father of Transcendentalism was a man named Ralph Waldo Emerson. You'll want to remember that. He gave Immanuel Kant, who was a German philosopher, credit for the term Transcendentalism, but ultimately Emerson was the one who created it. Ralph Waldo Emerson was a Unitarian church minister, and Transcendentalism actually started within that Unitarian church realm. Transcendentalism is not a religion, though. In fact, it seems to kind of push back against organized religion. Rather, it's more of a philosophy or a form of spirituality. It sprang up around Boston and Concord, Massachusetts in the mid-1800s, prior to the Civil War. Emerson first talked about Transcendentalism and expressed his philosophy of Transcendentalism in an essay entitled Nature. Before we go forward, I should tell you a little bit about the Unitarian Universalist Church. Ralph Waldo Emerson, as I said, was a minister of the Unitarian Universalist Church. Unitarian Universalists are well known as a group of people who are kind of a church without religion, which sounds really strange, but hear me out. The UU churches would encourage members from all faiths, former Catholics, former Christians, former Buddhists, Anybody who had a desire to get together with people almost in a social way, to sing songs together, and to delight in creation without necessarily talking about specific theology or religious beliefs, might consider attending a Unitarian church. Unitarian churches are not necessarily Christian, Protestant, Catholic, what have you. Rather, they're kind of a way of thinking. Unitarian Universalists were very open-minded when it came to what they believed. This is where that idea of you do you and I'll do me comes from. Transcendentalists, and Unitarians for that matter, believed that all truth is individual, meaning my truth might not be the same as your truth or another person's truth. They didn't believe in an absolute superior moral truth, if you will. And that being said, a lot of people within the organized Christian communities would probably consider Unitarianism a cult, that it's not per se a religious group that aligns with Orthodox Christianity. So Emerson formed this group as a former Unitarian minister, and they kind of took some of the things the Romantics liked and made them their own. Transcendentalists believe that all people have a soul. This is what I mean by philosophical rather than religious, right? And your soul is connected to every other soul in the world. I'm going to draw you a picture to show you what I mean by that. So, if my soul is this star here, and your soul is this star, and someone over across in Australia, this is their soul, someone on the other end of the world, all of these souls, according to the Transcendentalists, are connected to one another. Every soul, by virtue of its consciousness, is connected to every other soul in the universe. So if you have seen the movie Avatar by James Cameron, all of the blue people in Avatar have this ponytail thing, basically. And that ponytail plugs them in more or less to a universal consciousness. They're able to plug in to essentially a tree of life. They're able to plug into their animals and all kinds of other things. So all of those stars that we had connected together, those make up a world consciousness, which is also called the Oversoul. It's the suggestion that we are all connected to one another. We are connected to the universe. We're connected to all other souls. And so when you put all of these souls together, they make up the Oversoul. It's kind of like an umbrella. Kind of an odd belief, but really not that much different from everything and everyone are connected. Perhaps a little hippy-dippy, but they were the first ones to kind of consider this idea of the Oversoul and the oneness with the universe. When I think of oneness with the universe, I think of, that kind of thing. And that's sort of the transcendental look at things. Transcendentalism is not a specific religious experience. Rather, it's a desire to be more connected to the universe. And the easiest way to be connected to the universe, according to the Transcendentalists, is to really be a part of the natural world and to pay attention to the natural world. So if for Romantics, the highest power is capital N nature, Transcendentalists would believe that the highest power is the self, and specifically the self in nature. So this picture we have here is of Ralph Waldo Emerson. And when he was talking about his transcendental experiences, he said, "I am a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all." And that was one of the ways he described that oneness with the universe. So according to Emerson and the Transcendentalists, an individual is the spiritual center of the universe. If that sounds a bit arrogant, it's because it is. If you think that the Transcendentalists were self-centered, truly they were. But ultimately, they thought within every person is the blueprint that helps explain nature, history, and the cosmos itself. It doesn't reject the existence of God. In fact, a lot of Transcendentalists believed in God, at least in some way or another, but they preferred to explain things in terms of their own individuality and the world in terms of being an individual. When you think about Americans, this is something that we value. The experience of the individual. We value individual experiences, individual truths. Transcendentalism had a lot to do with that, and that's what makes it different from Romanticism. Romanticism didn't have that same rugged individualism that we see in Transcendentalism. So, if you are your own mini universe and your soul is the center of that universe, then the rest of the actual larger universe duplicates that structure. Basically, if you want to know something, you don't go searching outside of yourself. Transcendentalists weren't very impressed by education or book learning, even though most of them were quite well educated at Harvard, Yale, and a number of places. But they said it's not about education. Rather, it's about knowing yourself. All knowledge begins with self-knowledge. Aristotle said, "Know thyself." And this becomes true in Transcendentalism because if you truly know who you are, you're able to figure out a number of other mysteries in the world. Transcendentalists, rather than trying to understand nature in a scientific manner, they saw nature as mysterious and filled with signs, that it was symbolic. Transcendentalists believed in something called the pathetic fallacy. This is the idea that nature mirrors human emotions. So for example, if you have a funeral and it's raining, we often say that the sky is crying, don't we? We take it to mean that nature is in sympathy with the human experience. We also think if it's a dark and stormy night, that nature is terrifying or there's something scary about to happen, right? So Transcendentalists saw these things as being important to our understanding, that these were signs for larger and more important happenings in the universe. Transcendentalists also believed that in order for you to be good and to find happiness, so to have virtue and to be happy, you have to have self-realization, which is your ability to reconcile these opposing things. The desire to embrace the whole world, to know and become one with the world. So this is like your soul, trying to really connect it to that oversoul and see things as broadly as possible, the big picture, and look at things in that manner. But you're also supposed to withdraw, remain unique in yourself, separate from the rest of the world, an egotistical and individual experience. So they say in order to figure out who you are, you have to be one with the world and embrace the world, but also make sure you stay yourself, stay an individual. If it sounds confusing, it's because it is. Transcendentalists saw the world in a number of different ways, but the thing that I think that they probably could all agree on is that your truth and your experience are not my truth and my experience. Those things are individual. So here are some famous transcendentalists. Of course, our most well-known one is Ralph Waldo Emerson. We're also going to discuss Henry David Thoreau, Amos Bronson Alcott, who was the father of Louisa May Alcott, the writer of Little Women, Margaret Fuller, and Ellery Channing. Ralph Waldo Emerson was writing around the time of the Civil War is when he was the most prolific. He was originally a Unitarian minister, and he was a poet and essayist. You can tell that we've come a long way from the Puritans at this point, because poetry is an essential part of the literary experience now, and essays were his ways of talking about nature as well as persuading people about things. They actually had a club for Transcendentalists, and he was paid to be a lecturer and go around to colleges in the country and speak. Interestingly, even though he graduated from Harvard Divinity School, which is the place in Harvard where they ordain ministers, when he addressed the Divinity School, Harvard banned him for 40 years, presumably because of his unorthodox views about religion. He didn't necessarily reject organized religion outright, but he caused such a scandal with his lack of theology that Harvard said, you can't come back. What makes Ralph Waldo Emerson different from a lot of the Romantics, though, besides his club, was that he was a big supporter of abolitionism. He believed in freeing the slaves. And here's where we see what makes Transcendentalism really uniquely American, is that interest in social causes. We also have Henry David Thoreau. Check out his wild hair. He was a teacher, an essayist, and a poet, and he was Ralph Waldo Emerson's student. He took over for Ralph Waldo Emerson in talking about Transcendentalism. He's very well known for his book Walden, which is a series of essays he wrote after moving out to a little cabin in the woods, which had been loaned to him by Emerson. And he lived off of nature for 2 years there and wrote about it. He also wrote Civil Disobedience. During the Civil War, when he was asked to pay his taxes, he refused because he didn't want his taxes going to the war. He said, throw me in jail instead. And so they did. And so he was one of the founders of nonviolent resistance that Martin Luther King Jr. would have known about, among others. Henry David Thoreau influenced future environmentalists. He believed in keeping nature beautiful and having respect for it. And we really see a lot of his conservationist ideas in our environmentalist cares now. He was also a supporter of abolitionism and the anti-slavery movement during the Civil War. Amos Bronson Alcott. He was also a teacher and a writer, and he founded a school called the Temple School. It was unorthodox. Instead of just teaching the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, he was the guy that you can thank for introducing art, music, physical education, nature study, and field trips. He also argued that students should not be hit or beaten in school, and so banned corporal punishment from his schools. He had daughters rather than sons and educated them well, and he was the father of the very famous novelist Louisa May Alcott. Bronson Alcott was well known as the character of Mr. March in Little Women. He's a kindly looking man. So yes, he reformed the American educational system into more of what we know of today. Margaret Fuller. She was one of the first female journalists. She was a critic, a women's rights activist. She was the editor of The Dial, which was a transcendental journal. They had essays that they published in that transcendental journal. And she was one of the first female journalists to work on a major newspaper. She worked for the New York Tribune. She taught at Alcott's Temple School and really made a name for herself as a writer. Ellery Channing, one of the younger Transcendentalists, he was a poet and a good friend of Thoreau's. He published Thoreau's biography, The Poet Naturalist, and was well known for that. So here we have all our members of the Transcendental Club. Here are some more resources for you to help you understand Transcendentalism. But I think I would actually like to talk to you a little bit about some additional notes I have here to help make Transcendentalism perhaps a little bit more accessible. So first of all, Transcendentalism is smaller than Romanticism. Transcendentalism was focused on transcending the physical world to basically be a godlike self, the very best version of yourself that is connected to other people. The highest power was the self, the individual. They believed humans could transcend the physical world if they spent time alone, waited for inspiration, and were relentlessly individual. You could be above others in your thought. To help understand Unitarianism a little better, they believed that all paths, whether those paths were religious or philosophical, lead to God or they lead to goodness. They believed in spiritualism and appreciated and believed in supernatural powers without ties to a specific religion or to a specific God. They believed that people were good, were perfect even, and were already on the same level as deities. And they did believe that all human souls were connected to one another as a part of the oversoul. So that idea in Transcendentalism is one that I want you to remember. I know this is kind of confusing and that Transcendentalism is somewhat difficult, but just remember, it is Romanticism, but with a higher focus on the individual and an interest in social movements like environmentalism, like abolitionism, feminism, women's suffrage, and other important social movements. The Transcendentalists were behind those as well. They wanted society to move forward. They were our first progressive hippie types. Well, I hope you have questions and you should write them down because I will answer them when I come back tomorrow. We'll see you then.